Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for Chapter 25, America Moves to the City, 1865 to 1900. Next slide. The first section is entitled The Urban Frontier. America was transformed from a rural to an urban society in the second half of the 1800s. This visual over here shows a bustling city of the late 1800s. The first 100 years of American history, the United States was largely a rural country. That began to change after the Civil War, and the power and emphasis and influence of the United States became much more of an urban country as time went by. Next slide. New immigration. New waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe flooded the United States in the late 1800s. The United States is known as a nation of immigrants, and that immigration continued in the post-Civil War period, and it intensified, and the so-called new immigrants of that era came primarily, the European immigrants, that is, came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland and Italy provided huge numbers of immigrants to the United States during that period. And this visual here shows immigrants arriving in New York Harbor, probably on Ellis Island or on a ship about ready to dock in Ellis Island. And this is the first sight that millions of immigrants saw when they arrived in the United States from Europe. Next slide. Reactions to new immigration. The settlement house movement sought to help new immigrants adapt to American culture. There really weren't any government agencies at that time set up to help new immigrants, so churches and voluntary organizations stepped up in many cases to help new arrivals, and the so-called settlement house movement became strong in many cities. The most famous settlement house probably of this period was the Hull House, which was run by a famous American woman named Jane Addams, who tried to help new immigrants make the transition by providing them with support, housing, food, basic supplies that they needed. Next slide. Narrowing the welcome mat. Groups like the quote-unquote know-nothings blamed immigrants for the ills of society. Not all Americans welcomed immigrants. Second and third and fourth generation Americans often felt threatened by the arrival of new immigrants who they thought were taking their jobs away, and there was resentment towards immigrants. Next slide. Churches confront the urban challenge. Many traditional Protestant churches became more aware of social problems and sought to address those ills. Many churches became more active. They assisted in movements like the settlement house movement, and in many cases opened their arms to and did things to help new immigrants, like the settlement house movement. Again, there was a lot of overlap there. Next slide. The lust for learning. Beginning about 1870, a growing number of states were establishing compulsory school systems, public school systems. America's public school system emerged after the Civil War. Reformers like John Dewey advocated a compulsory system of education, that is, a system that would by law require all youngsters to go to school, to learn to read and write, to learn to become Americans. This was part of the Americanization process, and it would become the norm in all of the United States by the turn of the century. Next slide. Booker T. Washington and education for black people. There was a growing debate about how African Americans should be educated. Booker T. Washington, shown here on the right, was an advocate of vocational education, and he became one of the most prominent African Americans of the 1800s. Others in the African American movement advocated higher education for blacks, and kind of a debate emerged within the African American community about what was the proper role of education for African Americans, be it vocational versus access to higher education. Next slide. The hallowed halls of Ivy. The phenomenal growth of higher education owed much to the Morrill Act of 1862. The Morrill Act of 1862 established what was known as land-grant colleges throughout the United States, especially in the West. And the higher education system was aided by federal and state monies that created much of America's higher education system that exists today. For example, the California State University system in California, UC system, can owe their origins to this government act. Next slide. The appeal of the press. Giant newspaper chains grew in power and often sensationalized news in order to sell more papers. This was the time when America witnessed the birth of newspaper chains such as the Pulitzer chain and later the Hearst chain of newspapers. And later in this class we'll talk about how sensationalized news helped to trigger the Spanish-American War. Next slide. Apostles of Reform. Crusade-minded writers sought to reform society, and this would create a whole generation of new writers who were calling for sometimes radical change in America. For example, Henry George, who's shown here in this visual, advocated what he called a single tax, which would level society, and his ideas were similar to the ideas that socialist groups in Europe had. Next slide. Post-war writing. Horatio Alger's quote-unquote rags to riches novels sold over 100 million copies during this period. The American dream, as it's sometimes referred to, that anyone can make it, was personified in Horatio Alger novels, and these became some of the most widely read works of this period. And it had a lot to do with inculcating the idea that anybody, poor from humble circumstances, could make it in the United States. Next slide. Literary landmarks. American authors tackled the coarse human comedy and tragedy of the world around them. Perhaps the most famous writer of this period was Mark Twain, who wrote on a variety of topics and became an icon in American literature. Next slide. The new morality. Hitherto taboo topics such as quote-unquote free love became topics of discussion. American society was beginning to change, moving away in some cases from traditional religious Christian viewpoints on issues, and lots of change would ensue rapidly. Next slide. Families and women in the city. Women's groups advocated for suffrage and greater equality. The movement for women getting the right to vote was well underway during this period, and women such as Elizabeth Stanton and others became prominent advocates for women's suffrage. Next slide. Artistic triumphs. Landscape painting became very popular during this period. The arts were influenced by this trend towards urbanization and industrialization that was sweeping through the United States. And just like in Europe, the so-called Romantic movement highlighted nature and glorified nature in response to the increasingly urban society of the United States. Next slide. The business of amusement. Americans had more leisure time than ever before. Baseball became the national pastime. Leisure time was something that had been unknown before the urbanization and industrialization of the United States. And modern things that Americans today are used to, such as professional sports, were born during the mid to late 1800s, including the so-called national pastime of baseball. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 25. See you again, class.